Hey guys, just like I'm checking in to let you know, we're gonna go ahead and do our next lesson. And this lesson is going to be over solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing we have here is the quadratic formula written out for you. The formula is just x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, there is a song with that, Set to Pop Goes the Weasel, but I actually have a sore throat and I am not going to sing it for you today. Maybe some other time. So, there are three steps that we need to take to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula, and that is to write the equation in standard form, which is ax squared plus bx plus c, and we're going to identify our a, b, and c, and then substitute them in the formula and simplify. So, it's pretty simple. So, let's go ahead and do that. So number one, we have x squared plus 2x plus 6 or minus 63 is equal to 0. So this one is already in standard form because our x squared, x, and then our c. Um, so we're going to make a list of what our a, b, and c are. And a, b, and c are coefficients or constants. Please keep that in mind. I don't want 2x squared, I want 2. So in this case, a is 1. There's no number in front of the x squared. B is 2, not 2x. And c, our constant, is negative 63. So because this one is already in standard form, that is pretty easy and there's nothing more we need to do to start. So the first thing I want you to go ahead and do every time you're solving a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula is to write it out. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So, and if, some of you might be asking, well, Miss, why are you saying the opposite of b instead of negative b? The reason I'm doing that, guys, is that if b is negative, you want to put a positive there. If b is positive, you want to put a negative there. So a lot of people get confused with the negative negative. Just make sure you pay attention when you're writing that in. All right, so let's go ahead and fill in the blanks. So we have x equals the opposite of b, which is 2, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. All of that is over 2a, and I wrote a instead of 1. That. All right, so now we're going to simplify. The opposite of 2 is negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4, because 4 is 2 squared, minus 4ac. 4 times 1 times negative 63. So what is 4 times 63 times 4? Okay, so 3 times 4 is 12. Carry the 1. 6 times 4 is 24. Plus 1 is 25. So 4 times 60, negative 63 is negative 252. And it's all going to be divided by 2. And then that gives me x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 256. All of that over 2. So we have two solutions here that we need to simplify. We have x equals negative 2 plus 16 over 2 and negative 2 minus 16 over 2. All right, so negative 2 plus 16 is 14, divided by 2 is 7, and negative 2 minus 16 is negative 18, divided by 2 is negative 9. So our answers are x is equal to 7 and negative 9, or negative 9 and 7. All right, so number 2, we have an a does not equal 1, so this might be a little bit more difficult. So first of all, let's go ahead and write our formula. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. We're going to make our list of our a, b, and c. A equals 6. B equals negative 11. Remember, we're going to use the operation as the sign here. And C equals negative 10. So now we're going to substitute those numbers into our formula. So x equals the opposite of negative 11 plus or minus the square root of negative 11 squared minus 4 times 6 times negative 10. All of that over 2 times 6. So this one's a little bit more difficult because we have a coefficient for a. Now, one thing I would let you know is there are other ways to solve quadratic equations. This one works for every type, though. So whether it can be solved by factoring or graphing, some equations cannot be solved that way. But quadratic formula can solve any quadratic equation. So that is my recommendation. You can always use quadratic formula, and that's why we're focusing on it today. All right, so x equals opposite of negative 11 is positive 11 plus or minus the square root. Negative 11 squared is 121 minus 4 times 6 times negative 10. 4 times 6 is 24, and 10 is 240, and negative negative is positive, so plus 240. All of that over 2 times 6, which is 12. All right, so we're going to continue simplifying. So we have 11 plus or minus the square root of 361, all divided by 12. All right, and so then we have x is equal to 11 plus, it looks like the square root of 361 is 19. Okay, so we want 11 plus 19 over 2 and 11 minus 19 over 2. All right, so 11 plus 19 is 30, divided by 2 is 15. And 11 minus 19 is negative 8, divided by 2 is negative 4. So our answers are x is equal to 15 and x is equal to negative 4. All right, so let's take a look at number 3. All right, for number 3, you'll see that our quadratic equation is not set equal to 0. So the first thing we need to do is get one side equal to 0. So we're going to go ahead and subtract 1 from both sides. And this equation will be rewritten as negative x squared plus 2x minus 1. And then we're going to have our, what is our A, what is our B, and what is our C. So our A is going to be negative 1, because that's here in front of my x squared. Our B is 2, because that's in front of our x. And our C is negative 1, because that is our constant at the end with no variable. Our formula, again, is x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right, so now we're going to plug in our numbers into our formula, just like we have been. X is equal to the opposite of 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times negative 1 times negative 1, okay? And then that's going to be all over 2 divided by 2 times negative 1. All right, so we have x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root. 2 squared is 4 minus 4 times negative 1 is negative 4 times negative 1 is negative 4, or is 4. So 4 minus 4 all over 2 times negative 1. Oops, sorry, that's negative 2. I was already simplifying. All right. X equals negative 2. And 4 minus 4 is 0. Plus or minus the square root of 0 over negative 2. And here's the thing. Whenever you get a plus or minus the square root of 0, you know your answer is only going to have one solution. So we are going to have negative 2 divided by negative 2, which is 1. So in this case, x equals 1. What that tells us is this, if we were looking at this one on a graph, it would touch the x-axis, turn around, and go the other way. All right, so taking a look at number 4, now we have two things on each side. I'm actually going to move, instead of 4x minus 15, I like that one. I'm going to move the 3x and the negative 2x, okay? Now, I can do those in one step. The reason I'm doing this is that I would prefer my a to be positive. So we're going to add 2x squared and subtract 3x from both sides. And because the 3x has a like term, I'm going to put it underneath the like term. All right, so these cancel. So we're going to have 0 equals 2x squared plus 1x minus 15. Because 4x minus 3x is 1x. So now we're going to get our a, b, and c. A is 2, B is 1, and C is negative 15. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is write our formula like we always do. X equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC. All of that is going to be over 2A. Okay, and then we're going to plug in our numbers into our variables. So X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that over 2a. Right, simplify. X equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root. 1 squared is 1. 2 times negative 15 is negative 30 times 4 is negative 120. So it's minus 4ac, so it's going to be plus 120 over 2 times 2, which is 4. All right. And to simplify that further, we're going to get us negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 121 over 4. So now I'm going to write that out twice so we can simplify it into our final answer. X equals negative 1 plus 11 over 4 and negative 1 minus 11 over 4. Negative 1 plus 11 is 10 over 4. Going to simplify that to 5 over 2. And negative 1 minus 11 is negative 12. Divided by 4 is negative. Okay, so can your answers be fractions? Absolutely. All right, number 5. It also has something on both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and move this 24 over to the other side so that my right side can be 0. And so my new equation is going to be, after I subtract 24 from both sides, is going to be 9x squared minus 1, or minus 25, sorry, equals 0. All right, so what this tells us, this one does not have a b term. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. This is difference of two squares. This is much easier to do by factoring. If you want me to review factoring with you, let me know, and I'll send out a video. But for now, we're going to continue using our quadratic formula. Okay, so a equals 9, b equals 0, and c equals negative 25. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, Miss, why does b equal 0? Well, is there a single x in that equation? We have an x squared, and we have our constant, but we don't have just x. So if you don't have a just x, or if there's anything missing, the default is 0. All right, so again, formula, x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. All of that is over 2a. All right, so we have x. We're going to plug in our numbers into our formula. So we have x is equal to the opposite of 0 plus or minus the square root of 0 squared minus 4 times 9 times negative 25. Luckily for us, multiplication is commutative. That means I can rearrange these numbers to make them easier to multiply. Over 2 times 9. All right, so then we're going to have x equals, the opposite of 0 is 0 plus or minus. So I'm not going to have 0 plus 0 minus. I'm just going to put plus or minus the square root of 300. Now, some of you, or 900. Some of you might wonder where I got that from. I have negative 4 and negative 25 gives me 100. When you multiply, times 9 gives me 900. And 0 plus 900 is 900. And that is all over 18. All right, so then we're going to have x equals plus or minus 30 over 18. And that means we're going to continue just having a plus or minus number. So x equals positive or negative 30 over 15. Well, let's simplify that. That gives me 15. Let's see, they're both divisible by 6. That seems to be the highest. So that gives me 5 over. All right. On the Google form, when you do this, you will have to put in plus 5 or positive 5 over 3 and negative 5 over 3 separately. Put them in parentheses, or I'll be able to read it. Just make sure you're careful with it. All right. So I'm going to move the number 6. So we're going to move the 10x on number 6 by subtracting 10x from both sides. And that gives me 8x squared minus 10x equals 0. And so a equals 8. B equals negative 10, and C equals 0. We're going to rewrite our formula. X equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC. All of that is over 2A. And so we're going to substitute our numbers into our formula. X equals the opposite of negative 10 plus or minus the square root of negative 10. And notice my negative 10 is in my parentheses because it is a substitution. Minus 4 times A times C. All of that is over 2A. All right, so we're going to simplify. X equals the opposite of negative 10 is positive 10 plus or minus the square root of negative 100 squared is 100 minus 4 times 8 times 0, which is going to be minus 0. So since it's minus 0, we can pretend it doesn't exist, over 16. All right, and then x equals 10 plus 10 over 16 and 10 minus 10 over 16. 10 plus 10 over 16 is 20 over 16, which needs to be simplified. They are both divisible by 4, so that is going to be 5 over 4. And 10 minus 10 is 0, divided by 16 is 0. So x equals 0 and 5 over 4. Now, is it possible to get a negative radicand, the number inside the radical? Yes. If you do, proceed as normal, but you'd have an I in your answer. Don't forget the square root of negative 1 is I. Don't forget your I's. I don't think there's any on the assignment, but let me know if it does get to that. I'll double check it, but you should be okay. We're going to wrap it up right here. Go ahead, and if you have any questions, feel free to sign on to live chat or give me an email. Have a good day, guys.